Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 8, Specific Yixing Ore in Zisha Clay. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongzun Li.
大家好.
Hello, Pat. Hello, Zongzun. The opening quote of this chapter, written by Zhou GaoQi in 1640, begins, "Teapots made from such clays are able to enhance the color, fragrance, and flavor of tea." Is this quote in reference to Zisha in general, or were there specific attributes ascribed to different clays?
It's totally open to interpretation. I think it certainly was about Zisha, but whether or not it was about any specific clays within Zisha, no idea.
Since the book is dedicated to teapots made in Yangxian, it's most likely that it talks about either Zisha or Celadon, which was also a very famous ceramic produced from Yangxian region, which is nowadays current day Yixing.
I definitely agree it's talking about Zisha, or think it's talking about Zisha, but is it talking about specific ores of Zisha is the question from Jason. And that much I'm uncertain.
The book, Yangxian Minghu Shi, is almost certainly 100% about Zisha. It's very unclear. It seems to be part of an open question whether or not anyone in the Ming had ascribed specific attributes to different ores, even though they were making different pure or blended ore teapots at that time. What can we intuit from quotes such as this on the view of Zisha clay in the Ming Dynasty?
Part of the quote goes on to say that these pots are small, but they cost as much as 10 or 20 pieces of gold. You know, we see that there is a value being ascribed to these pots, and they're being weighted equal to gold, right? So that is to say that these are highly prized, whether or not coveted, we don't know, but they're certainly held in an esteemed position of value.
Also, my guess will be at the time, the categorization was still in a very early stage. People are starting to discover the value of such clay to tea and daily usage. From the name of Zisha, we know that people start to pay attention to some of the characteristic or feature of the clay, right? It's purple. And people would give clays of other colors, such as zhuni or red clay, hongni, with specific names. But it's not the same level as nowadays we would group hongli or zhuni alone. We will have so many different other specific clay names or some subcategories.
This chapter discusses the material versus non-material properties of Yixing teapots. Can you define those terms with examples?
For material property, anything that's related to the feature, some of the very noticeable feature of the clay, such as the color. We talk about in the chapter, we have Ehuangjuni and Jinghuangjuni, which is the different gradients of the shade of the color being specified into different kinds. For non-material categorizations, for example, like locations, Hongni harvest from Zhaozhuang versus Hongwei will be grouped into different types, but they might be similar in terms of color or other features. But because they are harvested in different places, that will give them a non-material categorization.
What I understood from the chapter was that the material property, right, of the fired ware would be something like the porosity or how the liquid, right, of the tea and the surface material of the teapot will interact. So whether that's pore structure or porosity or density of the material. So interactions based totally on the clay and its processing and firing. Non-material properties, the way I understood it was things like the size and shape of the teapot, which will have an effect on the tea, but it is not a direct interaction between the teapot and the tea liqueur.
That is correct. In my experience, some teapots are generally good or generally bad, or only good for certain teas. Which, if any, of these categories is related to the material properties of the teapot?
I think the material properties certainly have the larger impact on what is able to be brewed or what teas are accentuated by a teapot. Just yesterday, Jason, I was sending you some private messages looking at some teapots online, and I was mentioning not being as interested in one because it looked low fired, right? Not that you can always see online what a low fired teapot looks like, but that was me taking a guess at what the material properties of that pot would be. And so I believed because it was low fired, that it would probably be heavily muting, which is not something that I'm looking for a teapot, but is definitely a material interaction, right? So if the teapot, is low fired, has a low density, has really high porosity, it's likely to be muting, and that's a material impact on the tea, versus the shape of a teapot. While I believe the clay will have a stronger effect, a material effect, the shape will not have as specifically a noticeable effect, or not one that I feel like I can accurately attribute to any flavor impact.
Yeah, it's not just about the clay, but also the processing method, firing temperature. Those will all make a difference in porosity and surface texture. And also the size of the teapot might make a difference in the flavor.
But the size of the teapot, for example, right, is a non-material property. That's a construction choice. So that actually leads to the next question. How can a non-material attribute such as teapot size prevent a great material pairing with tea?
I really actually like that question because it goes to the heart of, what we think of when we choose a tea in a teapot as tea people. If I'm going to go brew a tea tonight, it's not so nice weather, but it's spring. So let's say I'm going to pick out a green tea. Even though I appreciate Ming Dynasty tea culture, I'm probably not going to take out my largest teapot. And that's because for me, I usually brew my green teas with near boiling water or boiling water, and in a very large pot, unless I'm extremely careful about the dose. That high mass of water is going to retain its heat for at least a decent amount of time in comparison to a very small teapot. And so without being very careful about the dose of tea, I'm very likely to get a lot more cooked flavors instead of some of the subtle flavors I want from my green tea. So that's one example where I think that the size can definitely impact the flavor outcome. Something else that I think specifically we recently really got a lot of experience with was when we were in Chaozhou. Not size, but the wall thickness of the teapots really had a very massive impact on the inner fragrance that we were getting from a lot of these dancong teas. So much so that, I really went out and was looking for thin teapots and actually did purchase a teapot, which I'm waiting on right now. But I went and did the same. I actually went and purchased some thin cups on Jason's recommendation because I saw a huge difference in the way that some of these dancong teas tasted when I was tasting them in Chaozhou versus tasting them with my wares at home.
That might also be related to your use of a tetsubin water. They believe that clay kettles are far superior for tetsubin, specifically for dancong. I posit that the system of categorization that developed in the late Qing is overly specific and narrow, creating subcategories and subcategories which lack relevant distinction. Do you agree with this? And if so, how can readers interpret the subsequent chapters of the book, which detail each of these specific ores in great detail?
I think understanding the historical classification is very interesting, and it's a useful I would say it's a useful context to have as a tea lover and a tea practitioner. As someone who's just an everyday user of Yixing teapots, I often find that these overgeneralizations, both broad overgeneralizations and hyper-specific narrow definitions, don't really become useful as a framework for either learning or everyday practice and use. And so in my experience with teapots, small as it may be in comparison to some other, practitioners, I've used dozens and dozens of teapots of these supposedly same clay, Hongni, Tianqingni, Junni, many that were supposedly examples from the same mines, and often to differing effects. And I think that as you've kind of established throughout the book, Zisha and Yixing teapots, this is a study of metamaterials. And so not only is the ore itself important, but the processing, the way that teapot was made is equally important. And so unless you are comparing ore that is potentially mined from a similar site and made by the same maker or with the same processing, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to draw extremely narrow differences from an ore standpoint. And so that's why I think it's useful to see the existing classification and structure for what it is, but it might not be the most useful for your learning. And so I'm hoping, Jason, that you're going to propose some other methodologies.
Test each individual teapot.
Lifelong learning.
Lifelong learning. That's a great point, right? I focused this chapter on the over specificity, talking about is goose feather, goose egg, Junni, or golden Junni. How different are they really? But to your point, can we make a generalization like all Junni is good for X, all duanni is good for shopuer, right? All duanni is muting, all Junni is magnifying, right? Those things are obviously incorrect beyond even just variations in firing temperature. The ore itself is a metamaterial with various impurities, potentially paragenensis in the ore as it was harvested, potentially blended with other materials in order to make it shapeable and usable, means that no two batches of teapots are the same.
Yeah, I think what we need to do is really to find a practical balance between overgeneralization and overspecification. As you talk about in the book, Jason, that much of these overspecifications are for collectors to tell stories to potentially increase the value. And it's really from a practical standpoint to stay true with our charan practice to really test if all of these different types, quote types, can make a difference in brewing tea and make an impact on the tea flavor. So I think that's what we need to focus on and establish, or trying to make our own sense out of the current system.
Could you identify Yihuang Juni versus Jinhuang Juni?
Ehuang Juni.
Ehuang Juni versus Jinhuang Juni?
Yeah, with a tiny bit more of a chromium oxide, maybe? No?
In the fireware, not looking at the ore.
Firewares, there will be some color difference, but I've not personally tested teapots made from these two clays on tea, so I wouldn't know if they will have any impacts on the tea flavor.
Place both in front of me, I don't think I would be able to identify which is which, or maybe even tell the difference between them.
Right.
I'm not
confident. If you offer me two choices, maybe I can take a blind guess, educated blind guess. If you just give me these two Juni teapot and tell me, what are the names, and I probably wouldn't know.
Well, they both fire to a Juni like color, right? They're both turning red-ish. So I feel like even beyond looking at the fireware itself might be more difficult to identify than the ores. At least when you see the ores, you might say, hey, these are two different ores. I don't know which one's which, but they're two different ores.
Yeah, and if we tweak the temperature a little bit, the color might totally change.
True.
Exactly. I look at the Junis that I have in my collection, the antique Junis, and I don't know what sub-ore any of them are. And I don't believe that really anyone within the collection circles would be able to look at it and say, of course, this is Dahong Juni, this is Huang Juni. So if there's low ability of identification and we're unsure of anyone's ability to differentiate these subcategories, is it really possible to draw conclusions about these subcategories of ore? Or is it better just to think of it as each teapot is a unique and beautiful flower, and we must figure out how best to apply its properties for pairing tea?
I don't like to scare away new practitioners, but I've felt, at least in my practice, looking back over the last 13 years or so, every time I've been told, oh, this type of clay will probably be good for X, or, oh, purchasing from a merchant, right? This should be good for green oolongs. Almost always, I started with their advice and tried that tea, usually to mediocre to decent results, and eventually started to explore outside of that and usually found a pairing that was better. So I think in most cases, the advice you get is not well explored. It's not well researched, and you're much better off doing that research on your own. One, it will make you a better tea practitioner. And two, it will yield a pot that is able to enhance your practice, and paired with the tea that you have found out through research is the best with that. Not a nice, easy advice for beginners, but that's what I've found to be best.
But is this a surprise that the Taiwanese oolong merchant says that their teapots go best with Taiwanese oolong, and the Yunnan pu'er merchant says that their teapots go best with Yunnan pu'er? Or is this just part of the hyperreal? It's that the merchants are selling you a story that they believe to be true, I hope, but a story about, what the best use of wares and materials are.
I think there's some general better pairings, like duanni is usually good with luni. But in this trip, three of us in Yixing, frequently we end up getting the answer from our charan in Yixing that, teapots are generally, if it's a good teapot, it should be good for all kinds of tea. There might be some directional better pairings, but I think I'm in alignment with them that there's no such very hyper-specific pairing of one type of teapot to one type of tea.
Yeah. I always was open to trying any tea in any teapot. And I think we've said as much on this podcast. And certainly we've done experiments together where we've tried every type of tea in many of our teapots. I think after returning from Yixing and just seeing how, both the craftsmen and the tea people use Yixing wares there, it truly is an everyday wear. And we saw all sorts of tea pass through every type of teapot. And after coming back, I really have been even more open than I already was to trying different teas in my pots. There's a couple of teapots that when we were there, we all purchased together. So we purchased a couple of the same pots. So I think we all have a Benshan Luni nice flat pot. And I have brewed every single sort of tea in that. And it's been great. Some have been wonderful. Most have been at least good. And yeah, there's a few teas that stood out as probably better than others for pairing. But I think seeing Yixing as such a utilitarian wear in Dingshu Town was really eye-opening for me, just as a practitioner in the way that I can start using it in my practice.
Although I would say wuhui is a exception. Don't put anything other than hongcha or shoupu into a wuhui teapot.
I haven't had any amazing pairings yet. I'm not going to agree yet. Maybe there's still time to figure out what wuhui was made for.
All right.
The real Dingshu special is using one yixing of a specific clay to brew the tea, and using a different yixing of a different clay as your decanter, as your gongdaobei.
Yeah, that way you can really tell the effects of the clay.
Yeah.
Wuhui gongdaobeis all the way.
I would say I take a slightly stronger stance on the availability and the possibility of more specific pairings, particularly when you get into antique wares. I think that there's a stronger possibility of unique material effects for specific clays that highlight differences in certain classes of tea.
We've all experienced it. We've all had tea with very high level practitioners who have made these excellent pairings and was part of the phenomenology, right, of their chashi. But I would say, at least with modern wares, my experience has been that while there will be some teas that will pair best with a certain given clay or pot, the use has been broader than I was, led to believe during my journeyman period as a tea practitioner.
I agree with that. Do you think that it has something to do with the firing? Do you think that wood-fired yixing Zisha material shows greater differences between materials that have also been wood-fired? Or do you think that the modern processing or something else that makes the contemporary wares still very good teapots, but more generally usable?
The question brings up something that's a really interesting observation from when we were in Dingshu Town. We heard from multiple potters that pushback kilns or electric kilns were preferred by them over things like traditional dragon kilns because there was a stronger degree of control. They were able to very finely dial in the exact temperature they wanted to fire their ware at. When we think about some of these older firing techniques, when we look back at Ming Dynasty kilns or Qing and ROC period kilns, it's very likely that the fluctuation in temperature was a wider range than what we see with modern wares. I don't think that's controversial to say. I'm sure it was a wider range. How much wider that range is, I don't know. But I'm sure that had a material effect on the teapot itself and certainly led to different interactions with tea.
The longyao, the dragon kiln, is still preserved in Yixing and will be ceremonially fired once every year. Much of the technique of firing that dragon kiln is still preserved, other than the firing material changed from pine wood to bamboo. So the effect of wares being fired in that kiln is not really desired by all the ceramists that we've been talking about in Yixing. The temperature, the smothering effect, the lack of control to specific atmosphere, all of that, they see that as a flaw during firing.
I think this gets to the difference between ceramic artists, makers of wares, and users of wares. I don't have a strong negative reaction to the idea of many wares deforming and exploding and collapsing during firing. I think excellent. This is a difficult skill. Wood fired, and I got one of the surviving pieces, right? Obviously, ceramic artists think to themselves, I'm going to have a loss rate of 30%. This totally sucks. But we know, even from other ceramics, we spend quite a bit of time in Korea, and the difference between wood-fired Korean ceramics and electric or gas-fired Korean ceramics is night and day. We basically only use wood-fired ceramics as teaware. And my general preference in Yixing, particularly looking at the difference between antiques and contemporary wares, is for wood-fired, whether it's the dragon kiln or a downdraft kiln. I don't believe that there's that much of a difference yet, or maybe I haven't had enough examples to find that difference. I think it's a viable theory that the contemporary wares are generally either good teapots or not good teapots and can be paired with many teas, maybe because their material effect is less than their wood-fired counterparts, than the same material fired in a downdraft kiln.
It's possible. It's definitely possible. I didn't see you buy too many downdraft kiln Yixings when we were in Dingshu Town, Jason.
Weren't that many available. It was a small kiln.
I mean, I bought some nice cups.
Oh, I bought some cups.
Yeah, I saw you.
But actually, I classified those as daily use, and those are actually not in the tea room.
Same, those are in my kitchen too.
Or whiskey shots.
Yeah, you know it. But I definitely think that could be right, but I don't know that I have enough examples to have really classified or put it within my framework.
So then the next experiment is we're going to get a commission, a set, another triple set, and it's going to be electric, pushback, downdraft. Same teapot, same clay, electric.
I love the sound of that.
That would be cool.
I mean, Zongzun doesn't want to buy anything else this year, but that would be great.
So I think it goes a long way to proving the theory, right? Whether this is just an off the cuff position, right? I don't have strong evidence other than my past experience that this is the case. But it seems, if not likely, it seems highly viable that this is a real effect.
Then that means we need to test it. That's what science is. Let's test it.
Well, everyone, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, the skill and practice of blending Zisha ore.